Former California governor and movie actor Ronald Reagan ran on the slogan, "Let's make America great again," emphasizing that he believed that things had gone awry during the 1960s and 70s and that we needed to get back to fundamental American values and interests. Reagan's appeal was to traditional conservatives, but he also was able to add other groups to the conservative coalition that still help to keep the conservative movement strong today. He began to attract the rank and file of American labor. American labor had been associated with the Democratic Party for years, but he began to chip away and get individual members of the labor class to turn conservative and vote Republican. Reagan was able to bring white Southerners who were still against integration into the Republican Party. These are social conservatives that had been part of the Democratic Party since Reconstruction, because it was actually the Republican Party that had ended slavery, and therefore the South had remained solidly Democratic. But it began to break apart over the issue of race. And while Reagan was not a racist, he and his campaign staff were not above using an appeal to whites in the South that they needed to come to the Republican Party, where conservatives like themselves were the majority. Reagan also brought the evangelical Christians, the fundamentalist Christians, into the Republican Party. It's a little ironic because he was the first divorced president the United States ever had. And yet he was able to attract those believing in fundamental religious principles into the Republican Party, particularly the moral majority. Pictured here with Reagan is Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell started an organization called the Moral Majority, which was initially just to research political candidates to see which ones they could approve because they upheld fundamentalist Christian values. But under Falwell, the Moral Majority became a political action group, backing candidates who believed in fundamentalist religious ideas, such as anti-abortion, such as anti-gay. And therefore, Ronald Reagan brings evangelical Christians into the Republican Party by appealing to their social conservatism. Reagan had an amazing ability to communicate, and he ran on basic American values. And so when you hear basic American values, what do you think? What is an American value? Well, that was his genius, because it means different things to different people. For example, how many of us are not pro-life? Everybody wants to live, right? and yet pro-life had become the slogan for the anti-abortion people. Reagan brought us the term family values. But what are family values? Can a gay couple have family values? In Reagan's mind, no. In Reagan's mind, family values were the nuclear family, with the father going off to work, the mother staying home, take care of the kids. In other words, that family that was pictured in those 1950s TV shows like Father Knows Best. That's what was in Reagan's mind when he said family values, but to the hearer of that phrase, it could mean most anything. That was part of his genius, having kind of bumper sticker slogans that meant different things to different people, but when they heard them, everybody go, yeah, right, we agree with that. He was brilliant at that kind of communication. As for policy positions, Reagan ran on the traditional framework of conservatives. Order and stability, law and order. Law and order becomes kind of a catchphrase for anybody who breaks the law should be punished. Small government, reduce the power of the federal government. Anti-communism, we must defeat communism at all costs. That attempts at social engineering, at changing society by government action, such as the New Deal, such as the war on poverty, were failures, and therefore the government should not try to change society. And finally, pro-business. Get rid of regulations, get rid of taxes, get rid of anything that holds back businesses from succeeding. Let the corporations make their own decisions. These were Reagan's policy fundamentals. When Reagan said that his theme was to make America great again, what did he really have in mind? In many cases, his vision was of simple solutions to complex problems. For example, to get young people to behave and to act in a normal fashion, we need to bring prayer back into the schools. The Supreme Court had outlawed Christian prayers in public schools. Reagan said, well, that's part of the problem. If we brought Christianity back into the schools, then young people would learn the lessons of Christianity and not act out. Deregulate business. Laissez-faire. Get the government out of the way of business, and then business will succeed. What did he mean by make America great again? Cut taxes. Because he believed that by cutting taxes on the corporations and the wealthy, that would increase their spending and spur on the economy. He had a kind of simplistic view of how to stop extramarital sex, use of drugs, abortions. Others have the self-discipline to just say no. And finally, he was going to make America great again by defeating the Equal Rights Amendment so that women could return to their proper role as nurturers and moral guardians of America. In Reagan's mind, there was nothing wrong with women working as long as they were not shirking their responsibilities to nurture and teach morality to their children. With these messages and with his new coalition within the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan swept the election of 1980. He ushered in conservatism as the bedrock of American politics. And with this triumph of conservatism came an increased view of the government as the problem, not the solution. The problem with studying Ronald Reagan is the perceptions of Ronald Reagan versus the actions of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a practical politician. He once said he'd rather get 80% of something than 100% of nothing. He compromised. He made deals. And yet, in the minds of conservatives, he was a no-compromise ideologue. They confused what he said with what he did. And so the image we have of Ronald Reagan for most conservatives today is this ideologically pure conservative, whereas in reality he was a practical politician. So part of what we're going to talk about is the myth of Ronald Reagan as seen by conservatives today, and the reality of Ronald Reagan, what he did while in office. Yes, it moved the conservative agenda forward, but it was certainly not ideologically pure and without compromise. In this video, the historian Bill Brand, talks about the two sides of Reagan. His rhetoric, which was starchly ideologically conservative, and his actions, which were of practical politician. To give you a better understanding of these two sides of Ronald Reagan, let me talk about the myth of Ronald Reagan on the one hand and what he actually did as president on the other. For example, the myth is that Reaganomics cured the economic recession that he inherited from Jimmy Carter, when in actuality, unemployment went from 7% to 11% during his first years as president. Yes, by the end of his presidency, the economy had turned around in 8 years. But his initial efforts to solve the problems of the economy did not work. Reagan was for a balanced budget. And yet, by the end of his term in office, he had increased the national debt by more than $2 billion. The myth is that Reagan was tough on terrorists, tough on communists. In reality, he simply continued the policy of previous presidents of trying to contain communism and negotiate with terrorists. In fact, he negotiated the release of those hostages that had been taken while Jimmy Carter was president. He also made a deal to sell guns to Iran, that very country that had held Americans hostage. They needed weapons to build up their army, and Ronald Reagan agreed to sell them to Iran. We'll talk more about that later. Star Wars was his answer to communism, and it still doesn't work. Star Wars was a nuclear or a missile defense system which would stop any rockets or missiles from getting through this umbrella over the United States and hitting us. We still do not have real accurate anti-missile capabilities. That he revitalized conservatism. Well, he did, but in the process, he also started creating the polarization that we see in politics today, where neither side is willing to compromise with the other. As I mentioned, Reagan was a practical politician, but many of those conservatives who have followed in his footsteps ignore that part of his time as president. Finally, that he cut taxes. Yes, there was a big tax cut right at the beginning, primarily for corporations and the wealthy. But over the course of 8 years, he raised taxes 5 times. He was flexible on tax increases, not hardline, never will I raise taxes, as so many conservatives are today. The view of Ronald Reagan today is that he cut the federal deficit, he cut the size of the federal government, all these kinds of things. When in reality, he increased the national debt, as did Bush 1 and Bush 2. The only president since Andrew Jackson that has had a balanced budget and a budget surplus was the tax and spend Democrat, Bill Clinton. We'll talk more about how he did that later. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that I am anti-Reagan. I hope you never know what I truly think about Ronald Reagan as president. That's not important. What you think is important. But I am going to concentrate on the historically accurate things that he did and programs that he put into place. The first thing Ronald Reagan did to try to deal with a bad economy was implement what became known as Reaganomics. It is also called supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. His critics called it Robin Hood for the rich, because the theory behind it was that if you give tax breaks to the rich and to the corporations, they will then spend more money and that will stimulate the economy. Critics of this trickle-down theory have pointed out that most often what happens is the money gets stuck at the top and very little of it, if any of it, ever gets down to the working class and the poor. Critics of Reaganomics point out that the economy may be great for the corporations and Wall Street and the stock market, but it's not so great for the workers, because often the corporations use that extra money for things other than employee pay and hiring new employees, and therefore it does not stimulate the economy as in theory it should. This belief in supply-side economics or trickle-down economics has become one of the cornerstones of the modern conservative movement and Republican Party. It is what was behind the tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy that were passed under Bush II and under Donald Trump. Supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics, favored still to this day by conservatives, believes that if you give tax breaks to the wealthy and to corporations, that will allow them to accumulate more capital. And they will then use that capital to build new facilities, to lower prices, and to create jobs. More jobs mean more people paying taxes. Therefore, the federal budget will increase because it's got more jobs or more tax money to spend, and that will then stimulate the entire economy. The other side, the demand side economics, which is generally favored by Democrats and was followed to some extent by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, says no. You don't give the money to the wealthy and hope that it trickles down. You give the tax breaks to the working and middle class. And that will fuel consumption. They will now have more money to go out and spend. By spending that money, they create more demand. To meet that demand, then the corporations have to increase productivity, hire new workers, and therefore you have more people working with more money to spend. That also increases the tax revenues for the government so that they can pay for programs and cut the deficit. These are the two basic theories that the two political parties to this day operate on, whether to give money to Wall Street or Main Street in the form of tax cuts. The supply side says it's better to give it to Wall Street and it will trickle down to the rest of the economy and stimulate it. The demand side says no, you must give it to the working people because our economy is 70% consumer driven. And therefore, if more people have more money to spend, they will spend more money, buy more stuff, and that will create a demand which the corporations will then have to employ more people to meet. So Reagan's plan to get the economy moving again was to reduce taxes on businesses and the wealthy, to raise taxes for the working poor and the middle class, to provide tax incentives to U.S. companies to invest overseas, to deregulate business and industry, and to break the labor unions so that they were not making demands on management for higher wages, better working conditions, and that sort of thing. This was basically his plan to get the economy moving again. Over time, the vast number of economists have concluded that Reaganomics had a negative impact on the United States, that it does not work. They point out, for example, that income for the bottom fifth of Americans rose by 122% between 1947 and 1979. However, when Reagan introduced Reaganomics, the result over the last 20 years was that the income for the top 1% rose by 270%, while the rest, the 99% of the rest of us, our income has remained stagnant and flat. It is this that Bernie Sanders is preaching in his presidential campaign, that Elizabeth Warren has been fighting about for years, that trickle-down only enriches the already rich. It does not help the ordinary citizen. In line with Reagan's views on labor unions, he had an opportunity to send a clear message to labor unions that the federal government was no longer their friend when the air traffic controllers and their union PATCO went on strike. Now, these were federal workers who were not supposed to strike. It was illegal for them to strike. But Reagan made an example of them. What he did was he fired all of them and then brought in new people to be the air traffic controllers in the country. This sent a message to other labor unions that Reagan was not going to be supportive of their efforts to force concessions out of corporations. Part of the economic challenge of the Reagan administration was that the economy itself was changing. It was making a transition from what was termed the old economy, that of manufacturing and industry, into the new economy, which is more about providing services. This new economy required more skills than simply working on an assembly line. And it created new challenges because more and more Americans with little education were finding it harder and harder to find good paying jobs. This transition can be seen in this graph, where in the 1950s, 60% of the American job market was made up of unskilled factory workers. By 2000, that number had decreased to just 15%, as more and more jobs were in the technology and service industries, not in manufacturing. And particularly service industry jobs do not pay as well as factory jobs had. This was not Ronald Reagan's fault. This was the way the economy was changing. However, some of his policies did help increase the speed with which manufacturing jobs were lost. Among young adults, the yuppie replaced the hippie. A yuppie was a young, upwardly mobile professional, and they had made the decision, rather than try to save the world, they were going to get as much as they could, a kind of a me too or me first emphasis. And they were very big into displaying that they had money, buying name brand goods. This is the era when they began to put the logos of the manufacturer on the outside. Before this time, if you had a Gucci something or other, it was not advertised on the outside of the product. Now it is. And so the Beamer and the Rolex and the Calvin Klein suits and that sort of thing become status symbols. It goes so far in the 1980s, after the introduction of the mobile phone, that was very expensive, but yuppies wanting to show off their status would buy simply the case of the phone. They couldn't afford to have a real mobile phone at that point, so they'd have the case and they could walk around and play like they were talking on this empty phone, just so it would appear that they were well off. It was also the era of the disco clubs, famous for their use of cocaine and the blaring disco music. In many ways, the young adults had turned from hippies into conspicuous consumption fashion plates. As a result of Reaganomics, the federal deficit ballooned, grew by the time of he left office, more than $200 billion. In the short term, the recession continued to get worse, to the point where it was the worst since the Great Depression. By the end of his term in office, however, the economy had turned around. The cutting of taxes for the wealthy and for businesses forced Reagan to agree to raise taxes in other areas because of the federal deficit. He saved money for the federal government by pushing expenses that would normally be paid for by federal funds down to the states and forcing the states to pay for these programs. An example of this was federal funding for the interstate system. Rather than paying all of the expenses of building an interstate, now the federal government required the states to pay a percentage of the cost of building an interstate highway in their state. Finally, one of the effects was revenue enhancements. They preferred this euphemism for a new form of user tax. For example, for you college students who have student loans, well, up until the Reagan administration, many of scholarship students were able to get Pell Grants. Grants were money to attend college that you did not have to pay back. Under the Reagan administration, they began to cut federal grants to pay for higher education and began to substitute student loans for grants. These loans had to be paid back, as you probably well know. And so they began to put paying for college not on the federal tab, but on the students tab. I mentioned pushing expenses down to the states, federal government not paying for federal programs like they once had. I mentioned the example of the interstate highway system, but it applied to all kinds of things, particularly to education, where now the states had to come up with more and more ways to pay for things that the federal government had paid for previously. And the federal government began to mandate that certain things, the states had to do certain things, but they were unfunded mandates. The federal government gave the states no money to do what the federal government told them to do. So the states more and more got into a position where they could not afford to carry out all of their financial responsibilities and pick up for the federal government. This caused the states to either have to raise taxes, which there was a tax revolt going on against, or to cut services, or to pass down expenses to the users. For example, states began to build toll roads instead of interstates. Now, you might not think of a toll road as a tax, but it is. It is taxing you for using that highway. Whereas before this, the state had paid 100% of the construction of that highway and it was free. Now you, as a user, are financing it. Another example would be college tuition rates. Back in the 70s, you could go to college at a state school in Texas for something like $4 a credit hour. So to take a 15-hour load would cost you $60. However, with the decrease in federal funds, states began to raise tuition, making it more on the user, on you, the student. These are examples of how the federal government began to force states to pay more and more of the expenses so that the federal government could cut its expenses. This trend started under Ronald Reagan. Supporters of Reaganomics pointed to the job creation that occurred in the country. This was true. More jobs were being created. However, a good many of the jobs that were being created were service jobs, like working in fast food, hotels, that sort of thing. They became known around the country as Mac jobs, not because there's anything wrong with working at McDonald's, but for most people, that is not a career goal. That's a means to an end. And so a lot of these service jobs, particularly part-time, were being created. But at the same time, we were losing those high-paying factory jobs. And so the job creation under Reagan is a little bit confusing. They did create jobs, but what kind of jobs? How well did those jobs pay? Now, again, this is not Reagan's fault. This is the way the economy was changing. But the reality is that if you look at the kinds of jobs that were created beginning with the Reagan administration, most of the job creation was in the service sector, which does not pay as well as the professional sector or even working on an assembly line in a factory. Opponents of Reaganomics painted a picture of an economy that took full-time, well-paying jobs and converted them into part-time service jobs, as depicted in this cartoon. The result of this changing economy was a change in income patterns. As you can see in these graphs, starting about 1980, the income of the top 1% goes up. The income for the bottom 90% of Americans goes down. Now, this is not all on Reagan's plate. He did not cause all of this, but a number of his party's policies helped to create this growing income gap between the rich and the poor. Again, most of this growing disparity between income for rich and poor was a result of the changing nature of the economy from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, and service economy paying the workers less. However, there were some things that Reagan did, like standing up against unions, that helped to increase the rate with which this growth of the service industry and the decline of the manufacturing industry took place. One of the phenomenons was the exporting of manufacturing jobs. American manufacturing companies found that it was less expensive to pay labor overseas, and so they began to open factories in countries where labor costs were less, manufacture stuff there, import it in the United States, and it was still cheaper than using American workers. That was not Ronald Reagan's fault. That was corporate economics and the growing of a global economy. However, Reagan did sponsor and get passed certain measures that increased this exporting of American manufacturing jobs. As part of his campaign against communism in third world countries, in non-industrial countries, Reagan had the concept that if American companies would open a factory, say in Mexico, and Mexico would become dependent on this American factory for jobs for its people, then Mexico was much more likely to stay on the American side than go to the communist side. This happened all over the world. And so Reagan gave incentives for American corporations to open plants in other countries as a way of spreading the American economy, this economic imperialism that we talked earlier about. He saw it as a way to get other countries to become dependent on the American economy in the form of American factories, and thereby bring them into the American sphere of influence. The byproduct of this, however, was that those factories that the companies are getting tax incentives to build in other countries are taking American jobs. For example, a car company opens a manufacturing plant in Mexico where labor costs are fewer or less, where environmental regulations are fewer, and it's employing Mexicans to make these parts. Well, that means they're going to shut down their plant in Detroit, for example, that was making the same part. So the Americans lose the jobs. That's the export of manufacturing jobs. That's why today your iPhone or whatever is made in China or Korea. Now again, Reagan did not start this, but some of his policies accelerated the rate at which American companies began to manufacture their goods overseas, thus costing American workers manufacturing jobs. The downside of this free trade global economy was that those in foreign countries who were working in the factories were often doing so at slave wages with no rights, while the American worker was losing his job. But the corporate America was getting fat and healthy. So that's the upside and the downside of the global marketplace. More goods that are affordable, but at what cost? Now again, Ronald Reagan and his administration did not start this, but some of their policies and policies of future presidents like NAFTA, that we'll talk about later, did accelerate this problem. One of the milestones of Ronald Reagan's presidency is, despite his conservative view on the role of women, he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female Supreme Court justice. Ronald Reagan's reputation as the great communicator were put on full display in light of the Challenger disaster. Challenger was a space shuttle. The space shuttle program had been going for a number of years, and it had been so routinely successful that the American people were losing interest in missiles and space exploration. And so NASA had the idea of putting a teacher into space. So they held a contest and they selected Christine McAuliffe, a teacher from someplace in New England, I believe, to be the first teacher in space. The idea was that she would teach lessons in science from space. And so she trained, and she boarded the Challenger space shuttle to go up to the International Space Station. And the federal government encouraged school districts to have their students watch as a teacher went into space. And so all across the country, schools stopped what they were doing that morning and turned on the televisions so that students could watch a teacher go into space. Except that shortly after launch and in full view of the television cameras, the Challenger exploded, killing all on board. This will become a moment where virtually anyone who was a school child in the 1980s can tell you where they were and what they were doing when the Challenger exploded. That night, Ronald Reagan went on television, and he became the national soother that, oh, this is horrible, but this is what it takes if we're going to succeed. That kind of thing. He soothed the nation in its time of grief. He was great at that kind of communication.